start with the detention of civilians by the Russian Federation. From the beginning of its armed attack, Russia began to detain civilians in areas that it occupied. It carried out what appeared in some cases to be security detentions, but in a manner that did not protect civilians or comply with international law. We documented 864 individual cases of arbitrary detention by the Russian Federation, many of which also amounted to enforced disappearances. Civilians were often detained during so-called filtration in occupied territory for their perceived support of Ukraine, their status as former Ukrainian service persons, or their perceived political opinions or affiliation. They included local public officials, humanitarian volunteers, members of civil society, priests and teachers. Many civilian detainees were held incommunicado in unofficial places of detention, often in deplorable conditions. In about a quarter of the documented cases, civilian detainees were transferred to other locations within occupied territory or deported to the Russian Federation. Often no information was disclosed to their families for prolonged periods of time. We documented the summary execution of 77 civilians while they were arbitrarily detained by the Russian Federation. Some of these cases were included in our report on killings published in December. Russian armed forces, law enforcement and penitentiary authorities engaged in widespread torture and ill treatment of civilian detainees. Most of those we interviewed said that they had been tortured and ill-treated, and in some cases subjected to sexual violence. Torture was used to force victims to confess to helping Ukrainian armed forces, compel them to cooperate with the occupying authorities, or intimidate those with pro-Ukrainian views. We documented 75 cases of arbitrary detention by Ukrainian security forces, mostly of people suspected of conflict-related offences. A significant proportion of these cases also amounted to enforced disappearance, perpetrated mainly by the Security Service of Ukraine. We documented over half of those arbitrarily detained were subjected to torture and ill treatment by Ukrainian security forces. This happened while people were being interrogated, usually immediately after arrest. We are not aware of any investigations by Russian authorities into arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, torture or ill treatment perpetrated by its own forces in Ukraine. This would violate the state's obligation to investigate and prosecute serious violations of international humanitarian law and gross violations of international human rights law. The government of Ukraine says it launched criminal investigations into each allegation of detention of civilians by the Russian Federation. To date, 23 people have been convicted, including 17 in absentia. We are not aware of any completed criminal investigations by Ukrainian authorities into its own security forces for such violations. I conclude by reiterating our request to the Russian Federation to grant United Nations human rights monitors full and unfettered access to all areas of Ukraine which it occupies.